Not a single person on the 52nd floor of the Blackwood building that night paid any attention to the small woman in a beige uniform pushing a coffee cart along the marble corridor. No one at all, except for a massive central air conditioning system, quietly sending out a fault signal that even the elite team of engineers belonging to the most powerful Mafia empire in Chicago couldn't fix. While the entire building lay wrapped in the biting cold of February snow, and Lake Michigan in the distance had frozen halfway over, the young woman with honey-colored hair tied into a low ponytail suddenly stopped in front of the machine room door. Her ears, the perfect ears once celebrated in the great halls of Juilliard, listening to a sound no electronic sensor could detect, a distorted low vibration, 7 short beats, 3 beats of silence, repeating like a discordant piece of fate. She stood still for 4 minutes, tapping her fingers lightly to the rhythm, then took out a small notebook and wrote it down in precise musical notation, unaware that 2 security cameras at the corner of the corridor were recording every movement, and that one of them was connected directly to the private monitoring screen of the most powerful man in this city. The next morning, in the mahogany-lined library of a limestone mansion on the outskirts of Chicago, the head of the Moretti family, a man the underworld called with a chill the Steel Hand of Chicago, would replay that footage not 3 times, but 5 times in a row, then turn to his old advisor and ask a single question. A question that seemed simple, yet held the power to completely change the fate of a human life. Who is that coffee woman? This is a story filled with tears and dignity about a young 27-year-old pianist who once shone brilliantly on the stage of Symphony Center, only to have everything taken from her in a single fateful night, when the car carrying her and her lawyer husband was struck head-on by a carefully orchestrated scheme, taking not only the life of the man she loved, but also the ability of her left hand to play. And then, as if that wasn't enough, her reputation was destroyed by the very perpetrator, a powerful senator who smeared her name with fabricated money laundering accusations, causing the entire classical music world of Chicago to turn its back on her and forcing her to grind her teeth and deliver coffee at night just to earn every dollar for her 6-year-old son's asthma medication, about a boy with amber eyes just like his mother, who once calmly told his late father in a dream that mother's sadness has its own melody, with the quiet understanding of a soul born for art, and about a 34-year-old mafia boss with steel gray eyes colder than a Chicago winter, a man who inherited a billion-dollar empire at the age of 21 and spent 13 relentless years transforming it from a traditional mafia family into an almost entirely legitimate corporation, a man who lived by a single philosophy that data is truth and words are smoke, and on that snowy night unexpectedly encountered something he had never thought he would find. A pair of ears capable of hearing the truth that even his million-dollar engineering team had overlooked. Let us follow this heartbreaking journey in full, where there is a silent confrontation on the 56th floor of the Blackwood building, overlooking the frozen Lake Michigan, a night in the emergency room, when a single mother with not a cent left had to pick up the phone and call the mafia boss, a shocking discovery at the Chicago harbor that could save 12 lives, a return concert at Symphony Center, after 3 years of silence, when she performed a concerto written specifically for someone who could play only with the right hand, and a simple wedding beneath a Sicilian olive tree, in the garden of a grandmother of pure Italian blood that only those who have been broken can truly understand the sacred meaning of. The story begins on a freezing Friday night in the middle of February in Chicago, when Noelle Ashworth pushed her coffee cart down the corridor on the 52nd floor, unaware that in just a few minutes, her perfect ears would hear a sound powerful enough to rewrite her entire life from beginning to end. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to press like to support the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any more emotional stories to come. I'll see you again in the next video. The last night bus pulled up at the West Side Street corner a little after 2 o'clock in the morning, and Noelle Ashworth stepped down from it with shoulders so heavy they seemed to carry the whole snow-filled sky of Chicago across her back. She walked another 3 blocks through the bitter wind, both hands buried deep in the pockets of her old coat, her breath coming out white and dense in the night air. The small apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an aging red brick building, where the wooden stairs creaked beneath every footstep, and the cooking smells of immigrant families mingled together into something both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Noelle unlocked the door as gently as she could, holding her breath so the hinge wouldn't wake her child, then slipped inside in silence. The living room was still dimly lit by a single small table lamp, and on the old sofa pressed against the window, her 6-year-old son was curled beneath a pale green wool blanket, one tiny hand still wrapped around the little wooden bead Rattle Harrison had given him on his 2nd birthday. Noelle stood motionless in the doorway for a long time, looking at Jasper's sleeping face, at the soft brown hair falling in loose curls across his forehead, at the pink lips parted in peaceful sleep, and she felt something tighten inside her chest, a sweet, aching pain that only mothers who have bartered away the whole world for their children could ever fully understand. She bent down, pressed the lightest kiss to his forehead, whispered an apology for coming home late, as she had whispered it on hundreds of other nights, then pulled the blanket higher to cover those small, fragile shoulders. Jasper didn't wake. He only murmured something in his dream that sounded like a short melody, and Noelle smiled faintly, a tired smile but so gentle it could have melted the snowfall beyond the window. She slipped off her shoes, walked to the tiny kitchen table in the corner of the room, set down her bag, took out a brown leather notebook, and sat in the familiar wooden chair. Under the yellow lamp shining across the page, Noelle's slender fingers began to move with a skill that had slept untouched for years, sketching on the 5-line staff a chain of dark notes that followed exactly the rhythm her ears had caught 4 minutes earlier outside the machine room door. 7 evenly spaced eighth notes, then 3 beats of rest, then the pattern repeating, yet with each repetition, the low bass tone shifted downward by an eighth tone, so slight that anyone without perfect pitch would have missed it entirely. Noelle sat there for a long time, tapping her fingers softly against the tabletop to the rhythm she had just written. Her amber eyes narrowed under the warm golden light, her mind racing through every technical possibility she could imagine for a large-scale industrial ventilation system. But the more she thought, the more she felt an unease she couldn't quite name creeping into her chest, because she knew this one thing with certainty: a system only gave off that kind of abnormal resonance when something that didn't belong there was hidden inside it somewhere, something installed at the exact point no one would ever think to inspect. She whispered to herself, her voice so soft it seemed to exist only in her own mind. Someone is hiding something very big inside that building. The words fell into the stillness of the tiny kitchen, and in that very instant Noelle suddenly noticed that on the table, only inches from the music notebook, lay the tarnished silver bracelet she must have removed at some point without remembering, resting there in silence, reflecting the yellow lamp like a quiet final note from a piece of music that had ended long ago. It was the bracelet Harrison had fastened around her wrist on their wedding night in a small hotel by Lake Michigan, and he had whispered into her ear a promise she hadn't dared let herself remember in the 3 years since. Noelle stretched out her hand, slowly slipped her fingers through the circle of silver, then gently lowered her forehead into its center, pressing her face against the cold wooden table. And in the absolute stillness of that West Side apartment just before 3 in the morning, between the even sound of her son's breathing and the hush of snow falling beyond the window, the first tear after many silent months finally fell, hot and clear, soaking into the dry grain of the wood the way it might seep into an old wound that had never been allowed to cry enough. That tear opened a door Noelle had kept locked for 3 years, and the moment her head bowed into the center of that silver bracelet, memory came rushing back like waves no barrier could hold, carrying her to the final night of her old life. 3 years earlier, Noelle Ashworth, then 24 years old, had stood beneath the brilliant golden lights of Symphony Center, her pale fingers gliding over the glossy black keys of a Steinway through Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto, and when the last note dissolved into the air, the entire 2,500-seat hall rose at once in an ovation that seemed as though it would never end. She bowed, her right hand resting over her heart, her amber eyes shining as she looked toward the front row where Harrison stood applauding, wearing the proud smile of a man who loved his wife more than the rising legal career he had built for himself. That night he took her to dinner at a small restaurant along the Chicago River, and in the flicker of candlelight he placed an old brown envelope on the table, held her hand tightly, and told her he had recently uncovered a few things at the office of Cornelius Whitaker that weren't right, that he had copied certain documents onto a small drive inside it, and that if anything ever happened to him, she must keep it safe and give it to no one until she found someone she truly trusted. Noelle had laughed softly and teased him for worrying too much, but she still took the envelope and promised she would keep it carefully, and when they returned home that night, she hid it inside the old ceramic urn containing her mother's ashes on the bedroom bookshelf, in the one place no one would ever think to search. 48 hours later, while the two of them were driving home on Interstate 90 after a charity concert, A black truck with no license plate came hurtling straight into the driver's side from the opposite lane at a horrifying speed. There was only a single blinding burst of headlights, a dry metallic crash that tore open the winter night, and then a vast darkness dragging Noelle down into a place beyond time itself. When she opened her eyes in the hospital 3 days later, the first word she asked was Harrison's name, and when the nurse only lowered her head and said nothing, Noelle understood, without anyone needing to speak it aloud. Her husband had died that same night, while she had survived by paying a price that took 4 surgeries on her left wrist over nearly a year. After the last operation, the gray-haired orthopedic surgeon sat beside her bed, took hold of the bandaged white hand, and told her in a gentle voice, thick with pity, that she would never play professionally again, that the tendons and nerves inside were no longer strong enough to endure the brutal precision demanded by the concert stage. Noelle didn't cry then. She only looked down at her 10 fingers, the fingers that had once flown over 10,000 piano keys for 15 years, and understood that a part of her soul had just gone still beneath those white wrappings, dying soundlessly like a candle blown out in the middle of the night. 2 weeks later, Cornelius Whitaker appeared in her hospital room carrying a bouquet of white lilies and an expression of sorrow performed too perfectly, squeezing her hand, speaking flowery words of sympathy about the colleague he called a brilliant attorney, and promising he would always stand beside her like an older brother. Noelle, lost in a fog of pain medication, believed every word, never knowing that the man holding her hand in comfort was the very one who had arranged the horror on Interstate 90. 6 months later, just as she had begun to leave the hospital behind, a set of supposedly leaked documents suddenly appeared in the press, accusing her of transferring $2,300,000 from her late husband into an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, shortly before the crash. And within a single week, the entire classical music world of Chicago quietly erased her name from every guest list, every poster, every warm telephone call it had once offered so freely. 6 weeks after the story spread, the only truck driver ever arrested in connection with the crash died mysteriously in his cell at a federal prison, closing the final trail that might have led to the truth. 3 years after that night, 27-year-old Noelle sat in the tiny kitchen of a West Side apartment, lifted her head from the silver bracelet, unfolded a wrinkled flyer she had picked up near the bus stop the day before, and read again and again the simple bold line printed across it. The Copper Kettle Cafe is hiring night shift coffee delivery staff, $14 an hour, no background required. 40 miles north of there, in a 16-acre limestone estate set among old oak woods outside Chicago, Sterling Moretti folded his tablet shut with a crisp, decisive motion, rose from the antique leather chair where he had been sitting for 50 minutes, and stepped out of the library with shoes that made no sound at all against the polished oak floor. He stopped in the middle of the long corridor paved with gray marble, took his phone from his suit pocket, pressed the single number already pinned there, and the moment the man on the other end answered, he spoke exactly 7 words in a low, dry voice, sharp as cold steel. "Rowan, come now. I have business." Then he hung up without waiting for a reply. Because in the last 13 years, there had never once been an occasion when Rowan Gallagher had failed to appear within 40 minutes after a call like that. Sterling walked to the great arched window, stretching from floor to ceiling, looking out over the rear garden, slipped both hands into his trouser pockets, and stood in silence watching the April snow fall slowly over the branches of 300-year-old oaks. The largest oak in the center of the garden was the only thing remaining from the time his grandfather Giancarlo had planted it there in the spring of 1948. And on sleepless nights like this one, Sterling still sometimes had the feeling the old man was standing somewhere beneath that canopy, smoking a cigar and watching his only grandson with eyes that never smiled. Vittorio Moretti, his father, had died when Sterling was 19 in an internal family matter. No one in the house dared mention even now. On a wet November night, when Sterling had been studying economics at Yale and received the call that changed his whole life in 4 seconds, his mother, Isadora Moretti, a slender Sicilian woman whose singing voice had sounded like shattered crystal, and who had once dreamed of becoming an opera singer at La Scala in Milan, before abandoning everything to follow his father to America, collapsed completely after her husband's death and passed away quietly 2 years later in a bedroom of this very estate, leaving her 21-year-old son an empire too vast and a heart too empty to mourn anyone but himself. Sterling inherited the entire Moretti enterprise that spring, and from the first day he sat down in his father's leather chair at the head of the conference table, He had lived by a single philosophy that hadn't changed in more than a decade. Data is real. Words are smoke. The Moretti Group was now worth more than $1 billion, spread across 3 main sectors of luxury real estate, high-end hotels, and water transport along the Chicago River and lake systems, with 700 formal employees and a complex network of partners reaching from Milwaukee all the way down to New Orleans. Sterling stared out at the snowfall, his mind replaying every line of data he had spent nearly an hour reviewing in the library. The 56-story Blackwood Enterprises building standing on Michigan Avenue, which he owned discreetly through a shell company in Delaware, was not merely a commercial real estate project. It was in truth the site housing the entire central financial server system of the Moretti Group, secured at a level comparable to federal banking standards. The building's 3rd basement held server arrays more valuable to him than vaults of gold, and the building's central cooling system was the one thing keeping those machines from melting under continuous 24-hour operation. For the past 3 days, the 7 most elite engineers on his payroll, each paid 5 times market rate, had remained on night duty in the technical room with bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep, yet still failed to discover the source of the abnormal vibration somewhere inside the system. And yesterday morning, the team leader had been forced to send Sterling a report, admitting failure with a bold final line that read, "We cannot rule out the possibility that someone physically infiltrated the system to install surveillance equipment." That was why, when the security footage from Friday night came up on his personal monitoring screen at dawn, and he saw an unfamiliar woman standing still for 4 minutes outside the machine room door with a notebook in her hand, Sterling's first instinct had not been admiration or curiosity, but one single word cold enough to chill the spine: spy. And he knew that in less than 40 minutes, when Rowan Gallagher stepped across the threshold of the estate, carrying his worn leather case, the investigation would begin in earnest. Exactly 38 minutes after the call, the sound of a black Cadillac rolling slowly across the snow-covered white gravel before the estate gate broke the quiet, and Rowan Gallagher stepped out, carrying the brown leather briefcase worn along the edges that he had kept beside him for 23 years. 58 years old, with white hair clipped close and neat, calm blue eyes that had seen through too many of Chicago's secrets, Rowan had once been one of Harvard's finest attorneys before quietly leaving the academic legal world to become the closest advisor to the Moretti family back in Vittorio's time. He entered the library without greeting anyone, set the briefcase on the walnut table, opened the combination lock, and drew out a file exactly 20 pages thick, clipped together in a gray cover. Sterling took the file from his advisor, sat down in the high leather chair at the head of the table, switched on the brass reading lamp, and began turning each page with the concentration of a financial analyst reviewing an annual report. The first page held an enlarged, still image of Noelle Ashworth captured from security footage. Beneath it were her full name, date of birth, West Side apartment address, and her current occupation typed neatly in one line: night shift coffee delivery worker at the Copper Kettle. The second page listed a brilliant academic path: a full 4-year scholarship to the prestigious Juilliard Music School in Manhattan, a major in classical piano performance, graduating first in her class at 22, with a thesis on Rachmaninoff that had been published in a national music journal. The third page shifted into the personal section, and when Sterling's eyes reached the first line there, his fingers stopped abruptly on the paper. Marital status: widow since March 3 years earlier. Deceased spouse: Harrison Wade Ashworth. Rowan was standing on the other side of the table, pouring himself a glass of Irish whiskey from the crystal decanter on the liquor cabinet. He paused when he heard the pages stop turning and looked back at Sterling with an expression 30 years of experience had taught him to control. "Do you know Harrison Ashworth?" Rowan asked in a steady, low voice, his blue eyes fixed on Sterling's reaction. Sterling repeated the name silently in his head, a memory from meetings 6 or 7 years earlier flickering past like a blurred photograph. "It sounds familiar. Some lawyer at Whitaker and Associates, wasn't he? He was present at that Clark Street port contract negotiation once." Rowan nodded slowly, stepped closer to the table, and set down his whiskey. "That's him. He died in a car crash on Interstate 93 winters ago. A great many people in our circles believe it wasn't an ordinary accident, Sterling. Harrison was conducting an internal inquiry into certain irregular money flows right before it happened." Sterling stopped reading altogether. He closed the file, placed it on the table, then opened back to the first page and studied the photograph once more. The amber eyes in the image didn't avoid the camera. They looked directly outward with a composure he had rarely seen in anyone who had ever crossed his life. the kind of composure forged only through long nights spent crying dry where no one remained to listen. Sterling sat in silence for 1 minute, then 2, before turning the remaining pages. 4 surgeries on the left wrist, a money laundering accusation involving $2,300,000 that had been closed for lack of evidence, but still left a black stain across her federal file. A 6-year-old son named Jasper, with severe asthma, and a final line recording in cold language, a total of $47,000 in unpaid medical debt accumulated over the last 3 years. When Sterling finished the last page, he looked up at Rowan and asked the one question that had been pressing at him since he first saw the security footage. Why would a coffee delivery worker stand for 4 minutes in front of the machine room door and record the vibration pattern of the cooling system more accurately than 7 of my engineers? Rowan took a sip of whiskey, set down the glass, and answered in the same calm manner with only 2 brief sentences. She's a Juilliard musician, Sterling. People born with perfect pitch hear things the most expensive machines in your world still miss. Sterling closed the file, rested his palm across the cover, and sat in a heavy silence before giving his final order in a low voice that didn't waver at all. Rowan, invite her here. Monday, exactly 10 in the morning, not 1 minute late. Monday morning brought a Chicago sky packed with thick gray clouds like curdled milk, and Noelle Ashworth stood waiting for the 152 bus in a Lake Michigan wind sharp as knives, her slight legs trembling beneath the old black dress she had once worn to a job interview 2.5 years earlier. Her black pointed shoes had a small peeled patch at the right toe, and she had tried to darken it with a black marker, but in daylight the flaw still showed clearly as a reminder of the distance between her and the world she was about to enter. The bus was crowded with early shift workers. Noelle stood pressed into a corner by the window, took out her phone, and called her son at Mrs. Rivera's apartment next door. Jasper, it's Mom. Have you had breakfast? I don't know what's happening with my job today, but if I lose it, I'll find another one right away. Don't worry. The little boy's voice came back clear through the receiver. Mom, I can hear that you're scared. It sounds like a minor, very fast. You should breathe slower. Noelle laughed, despite the tears collecting at the corners of her eyes, promised him she would breathe slower, then ended the call and rested her forehead against the cold window blurred by steam. The Blackwood building rose beneath the gray sky like a giant stone column piercing the air, and when she stepped into the main lobby of black granite, a man in a gray suit led her straight to a private elevator she had never known existed. The elevator climbed 56 floors in absolute silence, and when the doors opened, Noelle had to stop breathing for a second at the vast space stretching before her. The office on the 56th floor didn't look like an ordinary workplace. It looked more like a private concert hall, with a ceiling nearly 5 meters high, a wall of glass running floor to ceiling and facing out over a half-frozen Lake Michigan, and dark mahogany floors polished enough to reflect the slow drift of clouds across the sky. By the large arched window, Sterling Moretti stood with his back to the door, both hands in the pockets of a dark navy 3-piece suit, his broad, tall frame cut against the gray horizon like a sculpture carved from stone. He didn't turn when Noelle entered. To the right stood a long walnut table where 2 engineers were seated beside open laptops. The man around 40 with neatly trimmed reddish-brown hair was Cassius Blackwell, head of the technical team, and beside him sat Vera Kovalenko, a systems sensor specialist from Ukraine, with pale blonde hair tied back in a short ponytail. In the left corner, Rowan Gallagher sat in a brown leather armchair quietly pouring tea from a white porcelain pot into 3 small cups. Noelle was motioned into the single chair in the center of the room. She placed her small notebook on her lap and waited. Sterling finally turned around, walked slowly toward the table, and asked his first question in a voice as cold and low as the air beyond the window. What were you doing outside the machine room on the 47th floor last Friday night? Noelle rested her right hand over her left wrist, her thumb turning the silver bracelet by habit each time her heart began to pound, then opened her notebook. I heard an abnormal vibration coming from inside the central cooling system, Mr. Moretti. 7 short pulses at roughly 52 hertz, then 3 beats of silence, then the cycle repeating every 4 seconds or so. But the important thing wasn't the rhythm itself. It was the resonant low tone traveling with it. It flattened by exactly an 1/8 tone on every 3rd cycle, and that cannot happen in a normal operating system, because industrial motors vibrate at fixed frequencies. I believe there is an object inside the system that doesn't belong there, most likely near the pressure sensor junction, and the object's resonance against the moving air is creating the phase shift I heard. Noelle stopped, closed the notebook, and placed both hands on her knees. 3 full seconds of silence covered the room. Cassius suddenly stood, flipped open his laptop on the table, typed rapidly for several moments, and a 3-dimensional schematic of the building's entire cooling system appeared on screen. He looked up at Sterling with an expression almost disoriented. "Mr. Moretti, she may be right. We ignored that duct area for 3 days because no sensor there showed any fault." Vera nodded quickly, typing in more commands until a dense sheet of sensor data filled the monitor. "The sensor output there really is inconsistent with neighboring points. We assumed it was baseline interference. This may be the reason." Sterling turned and looked directly at Noelle for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, something inside his steel-gray eyes shifted very slightly. Not surprise, not admiration, but an absolute level of attention reserved for the moments when he realized he had judged something incorrectly. Then he turned to the engineers and gave the order in 4 clipped words. "Go inspect it now. Report back in 2 hours." Cassius and Vera closed their laptops, gathered the printed pages, and left the room with quick but silent steps, the heavy wooden door closing behind them with the only sound that lingered in the vast office for several seconds. Rowan Gallagher remained seated in the brown leather armchair in the corner, a cup of tea gone cold in his hand, his blue eyes never leaving the 2 people still in the room. Sterling no longer stood by the window. He pulled a single chair from the far side of the table, set it down across from Noelle, and sat with a slowness and a quality of manner he had shown no one until now. The distance between them was now no more than 4 feet, and in the white, chill light from Lake Michigan, Sterling's steel-gray eyes and Noelle's amber ones met directly for the first time since she entered. "Miss Ashworth, I read your file from beginning to end last night," he began in a low voice, no longer as cold as before. Noelle felt her chest tighten, as if an invisible hand had closed around it. She laced both hands together in her lap, gripping until her fingers blanched white. She lifted her head, met Sterling's gaze directly, and spoke in a voice that did not shake, even though tears already stood waiting behind her lashes. "I didn't launder money. I never touched a single dollar of Harrison's. I know you won't believe me. No one has believed me in the last 3 years, but I still have to say it." Sterling looked at her without blinking. "I know you didn't, Miss Ashworth. If you truly had $2,300,000 in a Cayman Islands account, you wouldn't have been delivering coffee through my building at midnight, in shoes with the toes peeling open." Those words struck somewhere deep inside Noelle so hard that she had to bite her lower lip to keep from breaking, apart in the office of a stranger. In 3 full years, not one human being had ever said that to her. No one had taken the trouble to look at her shoes long enough to see that the accusation had always been absurd. Sterling didn't speak again right away. He only sat there in silence, allowing the space between them to widen and thicken like a tangible atmosphere. Then, after nearly 15 seconds, he asked the one question no one had asked her in 3 years. "I want to know who framed you." Noelle felt the whole room tilt beneath her feet. It had been 3 years since she dared speak that name aloud. Not to the defense lawyer who gave up after 3 months. Not to the 2 reporters who called and disappeared within a week. Not to the one close friend from the orchestra who told her she was a liar and blocked every number she had. That name had been buried under 3 years of silence so deep she no longer knew whether she had the courage to force it through her throat. She looked down at her tightly clasped hands, at Harrison's silver bracelet on her left wrist, at the faint crescent scar hidden beneath it, then slowly raised her head and looked straight into Sterling Moretti's steel-gray eyes and spoke the 3 words in a voice small but clear as an A note in the dark. "Cornelius Whitaker." Sterling didn't blink. Not a single muscle moved in his face, but across the room Rowan Gallagher, with 30 years beside the Moretti family behind him, noticed something Noelle couldn't have seen. Sterling's index finger resting on the walnut table tapped lightly 3 times in succession, a gesture meaningless to strangers, but to Rowan the only sign that Sterling's attention had reached its highest possible level. Sterling let another beat pass before saying evenly, 3 years ago, Whitaker asked twice to become legal counsel for my group. I rejected him both times. Right now, he is the leading candidate for the Illinois Senate seat in the coming term, with a publicly announced campaign fund of $27 million. He paused. Do you have evidence, Miss Ashworth? Noelle nodded once. Yes. Harrison copied the emails and documents he found onto a small drive and gave it to me right before everything happened. I've kept it for 3 years. No lawyer, reporter, or agent would even look at it. Sterling sat in silence a while longer, then opened the right drawer of the desk and withdrew a glossy black business card embossed with a silver, two-headed eagle. He placed it on the table between them, without pushing it toward her. Rowan spoke gently for the first time since the meeting began, his calm voice softening the tension stretched tight as wire in the room. "Miss Ashworth, you have a full week to think. Mr. Moretti doesn't need an answer in a hurry." That afternoon, Noelle returned to the West Side apartment, with the glossy black card lying in her coat pocket, like a stone far heavier than its real weight. And when she stepped inside, Jasper was seated at the little kitchen table with a worn pencil in hand, carefully drawing black notes across music staff lines in an old handwriting workbook. The boy looked up when he heard the key in the lock, his amber eyes studying his mother for exactly 3 seconds, before he said, in the calm voice of an old man who had heard too much music in one small life, "Mom, today your sadness sounds like C minor, but there's a strange E flat in the middle. I've never heard that before." Noelle took off her coat, sat down across from him, laid her hand over his lightly curled hair, and asked softly, "Jasper, if one day you and I had to move somewhere else to live, someplace strange and far from this neighborhood, would that be all right with you?" The boy tilted his head and thought for a moment, then set down the pencil, looked straight into her eyes, and answered with the certainty only a child still untouched by life's lessons in hesitation can have. "Mom, I really like it here, because here the wind has music in it. But if you need to go, I'll go with you. No matter how different the wind sings there, I'll learn how to hear it." Noelle pulled him tightly into her arms, feeling his warm little breathing through the thick knit sweater, and realized the decision ahead of her no longer belonged only to herself. 3 days passed in a strange, muffled quiet while Noelle worked her night shift as usual, came home at dawn, read to her son, and each night before turning out, the light took the black card from her pocket and turned it over in her hand the way people turn a coin before making a fateful choice. On the 4th night, close to 2 in the morning, Jasper suddenly let out one long, dry cough in the darkness of the bedroom, then a second harsher one, then a series of wheezing sounds pulled from deep inside his little chest, like a horn choked closed. Noelle sprang up from the sofa, grabbed the inhaler she kept ready on the nightstand, but after 2 doses, his breathing didn't ease. It grew worse, and under the yellow lamplight, his lips began turning blue. She had no time to change clothes. She only wrapped him in his heavy coat, carried him down 3 flights of stairs in her night clothes, waved down a taxi on the empty street, and through the 17-minute ride to Cook County Hospital, counted every breath he took, the way one counts the final notes of a dying symphony. At the emergency intake desk, the woman in glasses looked at Jasper's insurance file with a distant expression and spoke in the professionally flattened voice that too many night shifts had turned cold. "Ma'am, the system is requiring an $800 deposit before he can be admitted to respiratory intensive care, because your annual insurance coverage has already run out." Noelle tremblingly offered 2 credit cards. Both were returned by the machine with the same red line denying the transaction, and while she stood there frozen, Jasper gave another dry, tearing cough from the row of waiting room chairs behind her. She sank onto the freezing metal bench, holding the child who shook in small spasms against her chest, each weak cough piercing through her like another blade. She took out her phone, removed the black card from her coat pocket, looked at the silver 2-headed eagle beneath the pale blue fluorescent light, and in one brief moment, hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before dialing the number printed on the back. The call rang only twice before the other end answered, and Rowan Gallagher's calm, deep voice came through, without a trace of someone awakened at 3 in the morning. "Miss Ashworth?" Noelle tried to keep her voice from breaking. "I need help. My son is having an asthma attack. They won't take him because I can't pay the deposit." Rowan said only 2 words before ending the call. "Stay there." 15 minutes later, a gleaming black sport utility vehicle with no plates stopped directly outside the emergency entrance. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, walked straight to the intake desk, showed some kind of identification Noelle didn't have time to see clearly, and in less than 7 minutes, Jasper had been admitted into special care under a pediatric pulmonary specialist summoned from his private home. Sterling Moretti did not appear once that entire night. But close to 4 in the morning, while Noelle sat beside Jasper as he breathed steadily under oxygen, one of the 2 men in dark suits approached, placed in her hand a plain white envelope with no name and no mark, bowed his head once, then turned and walked away without saying a word. Inside was a small folded slip of paper. Written across it in neat straight black ink was a single line only. There are no conditions attached. When the boy is well, if you wish, come. If not, I understand. S. M. Noelle sat in the hospital plastic chair holding the note, while tears slipped down without a sound. Not because her son had been saved, but because for the first time in the silent 3 years of her life, someone had reached out a hand to her without demanding anything in return. 3 days after that night in the emergency room, when Jasper's asthma had fully subsided and he could once again sit up in the tiny kitchen smiling over a bowl of oatmeal with honey, Noelle Ashworth stood before the old blue ceramic urn on her bedroom bookshelf, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the lid and drew out something that had lain hidden there for 3 years and 1 month. It was a small black portable hard drive no larger than her palm, wrapped in faded red velvet with a label in Harrison's handwriting attached to the outside. HWA, backup, March. She sat for a very long time with the hard drive in her hand, feeling the cold of the metal through the velvet, then carefully placed it in a small mailing envelope, slipped it into her bag, and asked Mrs. Rivera to watch Jasper that morning. During the bus ride to the Blackwood building this time, Noelle no longer shook from cold or fear, but from a completely new feeling, the feeling of someone who had been silent for 3 years and was about to speak. When the 56th floor office doors opened for the second time, Sterling Moretti was seated at the walnut desk with a thick report before him. He looked up, rose to his feet, and for the first time since they had met, he came around from behind the desk to pull out a chair for her. Noelle didn't sit immediately. She placed the small envelope on the wooden desk between them, peeled open the seal, took out the black hard drive, and set it squarely in the center of Sterling's sight. "This is everything Harrison collected in the last 6 months before he died," she said in a voice calmer than she had thought possible. "Encrypted internal emails from Whitaker and Associates, transfer statements between 4 bank accounts in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, an audio recording of a private meeting in January 3 years ago, and 3 fraudulent contracts Harrison photographed before they were destroyed. I kept this drive inside my mother's ash urn for 3 years and 1 month. Mr. Moretti, I think you're the first person who will truly look at it." Sterling didn't reach for the hard drive at once. He studied it for a moment, then lifted his gaze to meet hers, and asked in his low, steady voice a single question. "Why me, Miss Ashworth? In the last 3 years there have been lawyers, reporters, agents. Why now? And why a man you believed a week ago was a spy?" Noelle had prepared herself for that question over the past 3 days, but when it finally came, the answer arrived in the simplest form possible. "Because that night you helped my son without asking me a single question. No conditions, no strings, no waiting to be thanked. In the last 3 years, I've learned that people usually only give when they believe they'll get something back. You gave without believing that. And more than that, last week in this office, you were the first person who looked at me as though I were a human being standing in front of you, not a photograph stamped red inside a federal file." Sterling held her gaze for exactly 5 seconds, then sat down in the chair opposite her, placed both hands openly on the desk, and made his offer in short, unadorned sentences. "I want you to work officially for the Moretti Group, Miss Ashworth. The position is Industrial Acoustic Analysis Specialist, a role that has never existed before and is being created specifically for you. Starting salary of $180,000 a year, full medical coverage for both you and Jasper, and severance equal to 6 months of pay under any circumstances." Noelle lightly gripped the silver bracelet at her left wrist to steady her voice and asked the question she had most feared having to ask. "Mr. Moretti, is your real work entirely legal?" Sterling did not blink, hesitate, or try to step around the question with polished language. He looked directly at her and answered with a frankness that made her still for a moment. 70% of the Moretti Group's operations at present are fully legal under federal law and the law of Illinois. The remaining 30% lives in a gray zone that I am steadily moving into the white within the next 5 years. You will work only in the 70%, and you will have the absolute right to refuse any assignment that makes you uncomfortable, for any reason or no reason at all. Noelle reached into her bag, took out a slip of paper and a pen, and wrote 3 lines in the even slanting hand of a musician used to marking staves. First line: "My name must be fully restored through the legitimate legal system, and my federal record must be cleared entirely." Second line: "Jasper will never, under any circumstance, come into contact with even 1% of your gray zone. Third line. If a day comes when I want to leave, I leave immediately, and no consequences fall on me or on my son. She pushed the paper across the desk. Sterling read those 3 lines in exactly 7 seconds, nodded once, and answered in 5 words without negotiation. I agree to all of it. On Monday morning the following week, Noelle stepped out of the elevator on the 56th floor with a new employee badge bearing her full name in silver lettering against a black background, and Rowan Gallagher was already standing outside waiting to lead her to her new office, exactly 3 doors down from Sterling's. When Rowan opened the door for her, Noelle stopped at the threshold for the space of a single heartbeat. The room was not especially large, yet it had been arranged with such taste that she could hardly believe it was meant to be a workplace. A large mahogany desk beside the window overlooking Lake Michigan, a top-of-the-line professional sound analysis system by Clark Technic, 2 limited-edition pairs of Sennheiser headphones, a bookshelf already stocked with textbooks on industrial acoustics, and in the right corner of the room, beneath a small window, draped with sheer cream curtains, stood a glossy black Yamaha upright piano. Rowan spoke only one quiet sentence, before silently closing the door behind her. Mr. Moretti thought you might need it on difficult days. Noelle stood motionless in that room for a very long time. Then step by step she slowly moved toward the piano, stopping half a yard away from the keys, not daring to touch it. She had not stood near a piano in exactly 3.5 years, since that fatal night on Interstate 90. She raised her right hand first, looked once at all 10 fingers, then gently placed it over middle C without pressing down, only letting her skin make contact with ivory she had not met in so long. A quiet breath escaped her, before she even realized it had. Then, she drew her hand back from the key, lifted it to cover her mouth, turned away from the instrument, and walked to the desk, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Over the next 3 days, Noelle began the first duty under her contract, mapping the sound profile of the entire Blackwood building from the basement to the 56th floor. She wore the Sennheiser headphones over her ears, carried a directional recording device in her hand, and moved silently along each corridor, every ventilation slit, every mechanical room, logging every frequency her perfect pitch detected into the analysis software on a specialized laptop. Cassius Blackwell and Vera Kovalenko took turns accompanying her in technical support roles, at first keeping a cool professional distance, but by the end of the second day, both of them had openly voiced their astonishment when they saw that Noelle could separate 3 overlapping layers of sound simply by listening through the headphones, while the instruments needed 2 full minutes of data processing to reach the same conclusion. By the afternoon of the 4th day, while Noelle was reviewing the main duct region of the central cooling system on the 47th floor, she abruptly stopped walking, removed one side of her headphones, tilted her head, then put them back on. She turned to Cassius, who was standing behind her, and said in a very calm voice, "There is a micro-vibration frequency at roughly 803 Hz inside this duct. It is not the natural resonance frequency of any component in the original design schematic. This is an added object." Cassius immediately radioed the technical team, and within 40 minutes, 6 engineers had arrived with tools to open the ductwork. When the 4-foot panel of the main duct was removed, and flashlight beams shone into the interior, everyone stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds. Pressed neatly against the inner wall of the duct, and fixed there with a gray industrial adhesive matching the color of the metal, was a wireless listening device no larger than a matchbox, with an antenna thin as a strand of hair running almost a foot along the direction of airflow. The green indicator light on the device was blinking steadily every 2 seconds. Vera crouched to examine it with a handheld frequency detector, and looked up with a face gone pale. "It is transmitting a live signal outward. Someone is listening to us right now." Cassius immediately ordered the signal cut, and the device isolated inside a shielded box, while also pulling the maintenance records of the entire cooling system for the last 18 months. By 9 o'clock that evening, Rowan Gallagher stepped into Sterling's office with a thin report in hand, and laid it on the desk without a word. Sterling opened it, read the first page in exactly 1 minute, then stopped at the final line. Meridian Climate Services, the contractor that had performed the most recent maintenance in September of last year, was a shell company owned through 3 layers of cross-holding, the outermost layer being an investment fund called Halford Trust, registered in Delaware. And the actual beneficial owner behind that fund was Mr. Cornelius Whitaker. When Sterling finished reading, he closed the report, placed his palm over the cover, and said nothing for 2 full minutes. He did not raise his voice, did not strike the desk, did not speak at all. But Rowan, standing across from him, recognized the single sign of anger tightening through Sterling. His jaw had set ever so slightly beneath the skin, the line of it turning hard as drawn steel. At last, Sterling lifted his gaze to Rowan and said only one cold sentence of 12 words. "He has stirred the wrong hornet's nest, Rowan." The next morning, Sterling entered Noelle's office just as she was setting a hot cup of coffee on her desk. He did not greet her. He simply laid a folded satellite map flat against the wood and pointed one finger at a red-marked location in the southern industrial zone of Chicago. Clark Street River Port, 3 docks owned by the Moretti Group, has failed to unload cargo on schedule for 4 straight days. No mechanical damage has been reported, no workers have reported an incident, and there are no abnormal readings on the automated monitoring system. But container ships keep experiencing unloading delays one after another, and I am losing roughly $2 million a day in late penalty contracts. You have 48 hours. If you do not find the cause, I will be forced to shut down all 3 docks for a full inspection, and the loss will climb to $8 million a day over the following week. Noelle folded the map, slipped it into her case, asked not a single question, and merely nodded once before taking her coat and leaving the office. Clark Street Riverport lay 40 minutes by car from downtown, and when Noelle stepped out of the vehicle in a thick white coat and the yellow safety helmet the technical team had prepared for her, the wind off Lake Michigan struck her face with the bite of sharpened steel. 3 industrial blue gantry cranes towered against the gray sky, each nearly the height of a 9-story building, with steel chains as thick as a grown man's wrist swaying lightly in the wind. Noelle put on the Sennheiser headphones, lifted the directional recorder, and began walking slowly along the perimeter of the dock. She recorded the sound of metal chains rubbing across pulleys, the hydraulic pumps pushing in and out inside the machine housings, the slap of waves against the concrete retaining wall, the wind passing through the steel frameworks of the cranes. Layer upon layer of sound separated and analyzed in her mind, like the full score of a symphony being read at once. For 8 full hours on the first day, Noelle found nothing abnormal enough to identify conclusively. When dusk fell over Lake Michigan, she sat alone inside a red shipping container that had been converted into a temporary office, both hands over her head, honey-colored hair clinging damply from the harbor wind, while the first true sense of failure in her new career crept into every fiber of her being. She returned to the small hotel near the port that had been booked for her, tried to sleep, but could not close her eyes. Leaning against the headboard, she shut her eyes and in total silence began tapping her fingers on her knee, reconstructing every recorded sound from the morning in exact chronological order inside her mind. 1 hour, then 2, then 3 passed in the darkness of the hotel room. Near 4 in the morning, as she ran through the sound of wind, moving across the framework of crane number 2 for the 11th time, Noelle suddenly opened her eyes. There was something inside that wind that did not belong to wind, an ultrasonic vibration beyond the hearing range of ordinary ears, yet still close enough for someone with perfect pitch to sense through the skin at her temples. It was not wind striking steel, but the echo of the steel structure itself vibrating at an irregular frequency, like the sound of a string stretched too tight and on the verge of snapping. But cranes do not have strings. Cranes have steel cables. Noelle switched on the lamp, opened her laptop, and immediately pulled up the technical drawings for crane number 2. By 6 o'clock that morning, she had already called Cassius Blackwell. Have the technical team inspect the submerged anchor cables beneath the base of cranes 2 and 3 at once. Not the operating cables, the anchor cables. By 8:30, the dive team was in the harbor and had begun clearing mud from the anchor lines. At 10:20, the lead diver surfaced with a white face and signaled for the immediate shutdown of both cranes. 2 of the primary anchor cables beneath crane number 2 had been worn down to roughly 80% of the diameter of their steel cores. If one more 40-ton container lift had gone forward on Saturday morning as scheduled, the entire crane assembly would very likely have lost balance and collapsed where it stood. 1 hour after the shutdown order was issued, Hank Whitford, the veteran chief engineer who had worked at the Chicago Riverport for 37 years, entered Noelle's temporary office with a grease-stained wrench still in one hand. He did not say much. He only stopped before her, removed his hard hat in a gesture of respect he rarely offered anyone in his life, and said in the low, rough voice of a man who had witnessed too many workplace disasters, "Miss Ashworth, crane number 2 was scheduled to lift a 40-ton container on Saturday morning, and my technical crew of 12 men would have been beneath it, assembling the support frame. Do you know what you just did? You saved at least 12 lives this morning. He put his hard hat back on and quietly walked out of the container, leaving Noelle alone in the small room as the early afternoon sunlight slanted through the dusty window and fell across the 10 fingers resting on the tabletop before her. She looked at those fingers for a very long time, the fingers that could no longer fly across a Steinway keyboard after 4 surgeries, the fingers she had spent 3 years thinking of as the period at the end of one part of her soul. Yet this morning, they had saved 12 human lives. Around 7 that evening, when the port's technical team had completed all records concerning the 2 worn anchor cables, Noelle received a brief message on her phone. When you return to Blackwood, come to the top floor. We have a debriefing. I will handle dinner. S.M. The top floor was a place Noelle had never been allowed to enter before, a private level accessible only by a special elevator, and when the doors opened, she realized it was not an office but Sterling's city residence whenever he did not return to the suburban estate. The space spread wide and open, with high ceilings and dark wood floors, and a small open kitchen in one corner where professional Italian cookware was already in use. Sterling stood by the stove in a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, no jacket, stirring a pot of boiling water with a few strands of rich yellow fresh pasta inside, his head bent slightly as if checking doneness by a recipe long ago memorized. He looked up when he saw Noelle, motioned for her to sit at the square walnut dining table set for only 2 in the center of the room, then continued working. My mother taught me to cook pasta when I was 8 years old, he said while lifting the noodles onto plates and spooning over a simple layer of tomato sauce and fresh basil. She said a Sicilian man who cannot cook himself a decent supper does not deserve to be called a man. This is the only recipe I still remember after she died. He set the 2 plates on the table, poured her a glass of water, and himself a glass of red wine, then sat opposite her. There were no candles at that dinner, no music, no flowers, only 2 plates of pasta, 2 simple sets of silverware, and the debriefing carried out exactly in the spirit he had promised. You did better than I expected, Miss Ashworth, Sterling began in a calm, low voice. I contacted my attorney, Mr. Reginald Pemberton, this very afternoon. He is one of the 3 best attorneys in Illinois in federal law, and he has formally initiated 2 parallel proceedings. First, a petition to remove your person of interest marker from the federal record. And second, a petition to reopen the investigation into the Interstate 90 crash 3 years ago under a theory of intentional criminal conduct, using all evidence from Harrison's hard drive as new legal grounds. The process will take 3 to 4 months, but I believe it will end in your favor. Noelle had just cut into the first bite of pasta on her plate when her hand stopped. She set down the fork and stared at her plate for a long heartbeat, trying to stop the tears before they fell in front of him. When she looked up, her amber eyes were wet, and she asked in a faintly hoarse voice, Why are you doing this, Mr. Moretti? I am only an employee who signed a contract 9 days ago. I haven't done nearly enough to justify a top legal team like that. Sterling set down his wine glass, leaned back against his chair, and remained silent for roughly 20 seconds, his steel-gray eyes not on hers but turned toward the window where Lake Michigan had already vanished into the darkness of night. At last, he answered, his voice low and slow, Because you did not deserve anything that happened to you over the last 3 years, Miss Ashworth. Because Cornelius Whitaker very much deserves what is about to happen to him in the coming months. And because he hesitated, lifted the wine toward his lips, then set it down again without drinking. Your ears heard something mine failed to hear for 3 years. Noelle asked softly. What was it? Sir? Sterling finally turned back to her, and in the warm golden light of that room, his steel-gray eyes lost a portion of their usual coldness, leaving behind only a very human weariness she had never seen in him before. The truth, he said, with only those 2 words. That night, when Noelle returned to the West Side apartment shortly before 11, Jasper was already asleep on the sofa with his music workbook lying open across his chest. She did not turn off the living room light. She did not change clothes. She walked to the old upright piano in the corner, an instrument that had gone untuned for 3 years, and collected a thin skin of dust across its wooden lid. She opened it, laid her right hand over the white keys, and for the first time in 3 years, pressed down. A middle C sounded into the still room, then an E, then a small 3-note C major chord under the fingers of her right hand. Her left hand remained motionless at her side, still unable to play, but her right hand was still there, intact, never having abandoned her. For 3 years, she had never realized it. From the darkness of the hallway came a small voice. "Mom is playing the piano?" Jasper had woken and was standing in the doorway in his pajamas, light curls tousled around his face. Noelle quickly wiped away her tears and nodded. "Just a little, sweetheart." The boy walked closer, tilted his head to listen once more, then smiled with a bright, innocent joy. "Mom's happiness sounds like G major. I've been waiting a long time to hear it." Noelle drew him into her arms and held him tightly, laughing and crying at once in the room where only that single fading C note still lingered in the late-night air. The next 2 weeks passed in a rare kind of peace Noelle had hardly dared believe was real. Mr. Reginald Pemberton filed the petition to reopen the investigation with the Department of Justice on Wednesday morning. Harrison's hard drive had been duplicated 3 times, under the supervision of a notary, and Jasper had returned to the small private kindergarten in Lincoln Park with his usual bright smile every morning. But in a city called Chicago, that peace was only the silence before the string snapped back. Cornelius Whitaker had an old acquaintance named Henry Bancroft, a man who had retired from the Federal Bureau of Investigation 6 years earlier, after the conclusion of an unsuccessful inquiry into the Moretti Group. The man still maintained warm relationships with several active employees in the Chicago field office, and still exchanged information with Whitaker over lunch on the Thursdays of each month at the Glenview Athletic Club. On the second Thursday of March, Bancroft mentioned to Whitaker a piece of information that had not seemed especially noteworthy when he heard it from a former colleague. A petition had been filed to remove a person of interest marker for a woman named Noelle Ashworth, and the filing had come from the Pemberton Law Office, which had discreet ties to the Moretti Group. After hearing this, Whitaker could not swallow another bite of the steak on his plate. He left in the middle of the meal, sat in his car for 20 minutes without daring to turn the engine on, then pulled out his mobile phone and placed 2 calls in immediate succession. The first was to Rafael Contreras, the Mexican-born boss of the Latin Alliance battling for transport routes in southern Chicago against the Moretti Group. Whitaker whispered into the phone that Sterling was preparing a major legal move that might drag in many parties, and that Rafael should not remain on the sidelines. The second call was to Darius Kellerman, a 47-year-old investigative journalist at the Chicago Tribune, who had been receiving unofficial payments from Whitaker for 6 years, disguised as policy consulting fees. Whitaker sent Kellerman a preliminary file, along with a furtive photograph, taken 3 days earlier by his private detectives. Noelle Ashworth in a gray coat, stepping into the lobby of Blackwood Enterprises at 9:10 in the morning, holding an employee badge on a black lanyard embroidered with the 2-headed eagle in silver thread. The following Tuesday, the article appeared on page 4 of the Chicago Tribune's Special Investigations section, beneath a bold headline running across the width of the page. "Former suspect in $2,300,000 laundering case, now employed inside the empire of one of Chicago's most powerful shadow families." The article ran 2,800 words long, skillfully written to avoid making any specific legal accusation that might invite a defamation suit. Yet each sentence was arranged precisely so that readers would draw the worst possible conclusion for themselves. That morning, Noelle was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when the first call came in. It was Martin Oduya, owner of the Copper Kettle, his voice rough with irritation. "Miss Ashworth, I do not know what you are involved in, and I do not want to know, but this morning's newspaper has had the cafe phone ringing non-stop for 3 hours. I won't be calling you in for the night shift anymore. I am sorry." Noelle ended the call and set down the phone. Before she had even drawn one steady breath, it rang again. This time it was Helen Mitford, headmistress of Jasper's private kindergarten, her voice sweet but carefully rehearsed. "Dear Miss Ashworth, we have just received quite a number of calls from parents of the children in Jasper's class. They are expressing concern about the school's security environment. I know this is not fair to Jasper. He is a very lovely and well-behaved little boy, but we do strongly recommend that you consider finding a more suitable environment for him in the near future." The call ended with a polite farewell Noelle barely heard. She placed the phone down on the wooden table, folded her hands together, and did not call anyone back, did not open the newspaper to read it, did not call Sterling, did not call Rowan. She simply sat in the wooden chair in the small kitchen, looking out the window where most of the snow had already melted, and the Chicago sky was revealing one rare patch of early spring sunlight, and she sat that way for exactly 20 minutes without moving a single muscle. There were no tears, no sobs, no collapse of the sort that had nearly killed her 3 years before. There was only a silence dry and clear as the surface of a frozen lake without a ripple. When the wall clock struck exactly 10 in the morning, Noelle stood up, went into the bedroom, changed into a white blouse, put on her gray wool coat, slipped into low-heeled shoes, checked that her employee badge was in her pocket, asked Mrs. Rivera to watch Jasper for 2 hours, and walked out of the West Side apartment with firm, decisive steps straight toward the Blackwood building. 45 minutes after leaving the West Side apartment, Noelle stepped out of the elevator on the 56th floor and walked straight to Sterling Moretti's office, without stopping at reception, without knocking, and without giving notice. Sterling was seated behind his desk, reading through a thick contract. He looked up when the door swung open, showed no surprise, merely set down his Mont Blanc pen, and rose to his feet. Noelle placed the folded copy of the Chicago Tribune on the walnut desk between them, the paper having been brought over by Mrs. Rivera at 9 that morning, page 4, still open to the bold headline and the photograph of her walking into the lobby of Blackwood 3 days earlier. Her voice was not loud, and it did not shake, yet every word landed with the force of piano keys struck hard. Mr. Moretti, you promised me that my son would never have to face any consequences from this work. What is this, sir? This morning Jasper's school asked me to find another place for him. The cafe fired me. My face is in the newspaper. This is not what you guaranteed me under my 3 conditions. Sterling stood still across from her for exactly 4 seconds, and for the first time since they had known one another, Noelle saw unmistakable anger come over his face. Not an explosive anger, but something cold and concentrated gathering at his jaw and in the corners of his eyes. And more important than that, she realized that anger was not aimed at her. Miss Ashworth, this article is not my doing, he said in a low voice compressed beneath all the discipline of a man accustomed to commanding other men. This is Whitaker striking back. He learned about Reginald Pemberton's petition through an old contact in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he is trying to use public pressure to force me to withdraw before the investigation is officially reopened. I warned you on the day you signed the contract. Things would have to get worse before they could get better. We are exactly at that moment now, and it has only just begun. Noelle bit hard on her lower lip, one hand still gripping the edge of the desk, her eyes wet, but refusing to let a single tear fall. I do not need it to get better, Mr. Moretti. I only need my son to be safe. If the price of restoring my name is that 6-year-old Jasper has to grow up being called the son of a Mafia mother, then I do not want to pay that price. Sterling stepped slowly out from behind the desk and stopped about 5 feet away from her. His voice lowered further, slower, but firmer. If you quit now, Whitaker will not let you go, Miss Ashworth. He will hunt you and Jasper for the rest of your lives, because you still hold the hard drive, because you are still the only surviving witness. This is not a battle you can walk away from halfway through. You have to choose, and you have to choose today. Continue enduring in the dark, the way you have for the last 3 years, or step into the light and fight until this ends for real. Noelle sat in silence for a long while, then at last lowered herself into the single chair in front of the desk, both hands tightly interlaced in her lap. Sterling presented 3 solutions that had clearly been prepared in advance. First, a 3-person security detail from the fully legal private protection firm Vanguard Shield would follow Jasper at a discreet distance throughout school hours and on the journey home, all 3 of them former agents. None in uniform, none drawing attention from anyone except Noelle herself. Second, an elite private school named Lakeshore Country Day in the northern suburbs, where the headmistress, Dr. Margaret Holloway, had been an old schoolmate of Sterling's mother, would accept Jasper into 1st grade the following Monday, without reading a single newspaper article. Third, she and her son would move into a 63-square-meter apartment in a residential tower on Wacker Drive, owned by the Moretti Group, a building whose security system met banking standards and whose rent would be free for the entire time she remained employed by the group. Noelle took the documents, stood, and left the office without giving him an answer. That night at around 8 o'clock, while she sat at the kitchen table writing down the tangled thoughts filling her mind, the phone on the table suddenly began to vibrate with a number she had removed from her contacts 3 years earlier. The name on the screen read, Yuki Tanabe. Noelle answered after 4 rings, her voice trembling slightly. Hello? The calm voice of the 55-year-old Japanese conductor who had led her at orchestra hall for 2 full seasons came across the line. Noelle, it is your teacher. I read the paper this morning. I want you to know one thing before anything else. I know that article is not true. I have always known. From the very first day, 3 years ago. Noelle could not force a single sound from her throat, and silent tears ran down her cheeks. Yuki continued. Symphony Center is preparing a charity concert on Saturday of the second week of June, 3 months from now, to raise money for children with asthma at 3 pediatric hospitals in Chicago. I have been asked to conduct it. And I want you, Noelle Ashworth, to compose the concerto for that orchestra. I know your left hand can no longer play, but your mind is still whole, and I need you. Noelle set the phone down on the table, lifted her eyes to Jasper sitting in the middle of the living room floor, stacking colored wooden blocks into a small castle, and she cried, not because she was sad, but because for the first time in 3 years, a door that had once slammed shut in her face was beginning to open from the other side. The first week in the secure apartment on Wacker Drive passed slowly, like one long note fading into silence. Jasper had his first day at Lakeshore Country Day and came home with a drawing of himself and a new friend named Emma chasing a yellow butterfly together. The new apartment was 3 times larger than their old one, with a living room overlooking a curve of the Chicago River and a black upright piano that Sterling had arranged to have delivered before they moved in. Noelle did not ask for it to be removed. Every night after Jasper had fallen asleep, she sat at that piano, opened her music notebook, and began writing the concerto Yuki had commissioned, giving the piece the title, The Language of What Cannot Be Said, a work in 4 movements, designed especially with a piano part written for a right hand left without its partner. During that same period, at a small, discreet Italian restaurant in Chicago's western Little Italy, Sterling Moretti held a private meeting lasting 47 minutes with Rafael Contreras. There were no bodyguards, no recording devices, only a bottle of red Montepulciano wine and 3 folders laid out between them on the table. When Sterling slid the second folder over to Rafael, containing financial statements showing that Whitaker had quietly siphoned off $2,800,000 from the Latin Alliance's shared fund over the course of 14 months, Rafael silently read to the final line, closed the folder, then said in an even low voice, Sterling, I did not think he would dare this much. I will cut off every form of support to Whitaker from my side. He will face the law alone. No one in our world will step forward to help him now. Sterling nodded once, poured more wine into the other man's glass, and ended the meeting with a brief handshake. On Thursday evening of Noelle's 3rd week in the new apartment, just as the clock struck 9, Sterling came to the door to report to her on the progress of Mr. Pemberton's case. The doorman downstairs had called ahead. Noelle unlocked the door remotely through the camera system, then turned back to continue writing the final notes of the 4th movement she had been working on. Sterling stepped out of the elevator into the apartment's private hallway and heard the sound of piano coming from behind the door. A slow melody made of single tones struck by the fingers of the right hand, unmistakably the song of one hand singing in place of 2. He stopped at the slightly open doorway and did not enter, only stood there listening until the last note gradually disappeared into the air. Noelle turned and startled. Mr. Moretti, I am sorry. I did not know you had arrived. Sterling did not answer immediately. He stepped inside slowly, closed the door behind him, and asked almost in a whisper, Please do not stop. Is that the music you are writing? Noelle nodded, her hand still resting on the keys. The 4th movement. I call it Return. Sterling walked to the long sofa facing the piano and sat down, both hands resting on his knees as if afraid he might disturb something fragile in the air. I have never heard anything like this in my life, he said softly. There was a silence, and then he told her in a low, deep voice, something he had told no one in 13 years. My mother, Isadora, once sang the aria Casta Diva in a vocal competition in Palermo at 20 years old and won first prize. Then she met my father, gave up every dream of La Scala, came to America, and never sang aloud again. Only now, hearing you play with one hand, do I understand what she tried to tell me for so many years before she died. Music is not something a person can leave behind. At that very moment, the soft sound of bare feet came across the wooden floor. Jasper stepped out from the bedroom doorway in pale blue pajamas, patterned with musical notes, his light curls rumpled, his amber eyes wide with sleep. Mom, I cannot sleep. He noticed the stranger on the sofa and paused for a second, but he was not afraid, only curious. Sterling rose slowly, and then in a gesture Noelle never would have imagined from this man. He bent down and lowered himself to one knee, bringing his whole tall frame down to the eye level of a 6-year-old boy. Jasper walked closer, tilted his head, studied Sterling's face for a moment, then said in a calm voice, far older than his years, "You have very sad eyes, like my mom's eyes used to be." Sterling went still. Nearly a full minute passed before he found his voice again, and when he did, it was softer than either Noelle or Jasper had ever heard from him. "You are right, little man. But I am learning how to be less sad every day." Jasper nodded very seriously, like a physician confirming a diagnosis. "Music helps, sir. My mom says so." The boy turned away, took his mother's hand, and went back to the bedroom. When Sterling had left the apartment 40 minutes later, Noelle stood with her back against the living room window frame, looking down at the yellow city lights reflected across the surface of the Chicago River below. And for the first time, she realized something she had been trying not to admit for the past 2 weeks. Somehow, without knowing exactly when it began, she had started allowing that man to step into her life. 2.5 months passed like a quiet current that never stopped moving forward. Noelle completed all 4 movements of the concerto, the language of what cannot be said, on the last night of May, when apple blossoms had opened white along the Chicago River, and the last of the snow had finally vanished from the rooftops of the city's high-rise buildings. On the final Tuesday morning of May, while Noelle was making coffee in the kitchen of the Wacker Drive apartment, her phone vibrated with a call from Mr. Reginald Pemberton's office. The old lawyer's deep, steady voice on the other end said exactly 2 sentences. "Miss Ashworth, the Department of Justice has just signed the order, fully removing the person of interest designation from your federal file. As of this morning, you are officially cleared." 2 hours after that call, Cornelius Whitaker's black Mercedes stopped outside Terminal 5 at O'Hare Airport at 12 minutes past 10, and as he handed over his passport at the counter to board a business-class flight to Panama City, 6 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, in plain clothes, approached from 4 directions. That afternoon, every Chicago news channel ran the same breaking line across the screen. Former senior partner of Whitaker and Associates arrested at O'Hare Airport on charges of federal fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and suspected conspiracy in the murder of attorney Harrison Ashworth 3 years earlier. By Saturday morning, the Chicago Tribune had printed on its front page a formal 6-page apology, signed by Editor-in-Chief Warren Holbrook, retracting the entire article by Darius Kellerman, and publishing alongside it a corrected photograph of Noelle and legal records that had been partially declassified. Noelle sat on the sofa with Jasper that morning, the newspaper spread across her lap, her hands trembling slightly as she turned each page. She felt no triumph and no thrill of victory, heard no inner cry of celebration, only something very quiet, spreading gently through her chest, like the surface of a lake after the waves have finally gone still. Jasper rested his head against his mother's shoulder and asked softly, "Mom, are you happy now?" Noelle kissed his curly hair and answered slowly, "I don't know if this is exactly happiness, sweetheart. I only feel that I've been restored. That's what I've needed for the last 3 years." On the second Saturday of June, Symphony Center blazed with light in the cool first days of a Chicago summer, and all 2,500 seats across the 3 levels of Orchestra Hall were filled. Noelle stood behind the curtain in a plain black evening gown that fell to her ankles, wearing no jewelry except Harrison's silver bracelet on her left wrist, her honey-colored hair left loose over her shoulders. Yuki Tanabe came to her and took both of her hands in his. "Noelle, are you ready?" She smiled, a small smile but a steady one. "Professor, I've been ready for 3 years." When the stage lights softened and Yuki raised his baton, the first movement, "The Day I Lost You," began with slow violin lines, mournful without complaint, like the silent weeping of someone who has cried so much that tears no longer fall. The second movement, "The Long Darkness," drew the entire string section into a low and haunted register that lingered for nearly 6 minutes, while the piano on stage remained silent beneath the golden light, not a single note yet spoken. Then, in the third movement, "What Was Heard," Noelle stepped out from behind the curtain, and the hall fell into such complete silence that the audience could hear her footsteps on the wooden floor. She sat down at the bench, placed her right hand on the keys, and the first piano note sounded, followed by a chain of melodies, written with such delicacy that one hand alone seemed to fill the air as though 2 hands were playing together, the arpeggiated chords stretching across 3 octaves under the command of ears that had listened even to the silence of 3 long years. In the audience, halfway up the second tier, seat M23, Sterling Moretti sat alone. For the first time in 13 years, He had come to a public place without a single bodyguard at his side. The seat beside him, M24, remained empty, a program booklet resting on it. He had bought that ticket for Jasper, but the boy was sleeping peacefully in the Wacker Drive apartment under Mrs. Rivera's care. The fourth movement, Return, opened with a theme so simple and quiet it seemed almost fragile, then rose through variations until the entire orchestra and the piano joined in a climax that did not scream but soaked into the heart like the sea after a storm. The final note was a 3-tone C major chord pressed down by Noel's right hand in unison with the full string section, held for 7 seconds, then slowly fading into the air like the last breath of someone who has finally been forgiven. The hall remained silent for a brief few seconds. Then all 2,500 people rose at once, and the applause lasted a full 12 minutes without stopping. When Noel bowed for the last time and slipped quietly back behind the curtain, Sterling was already waiting at the backstage door with a bouquet of white hydrangeas touched with pale blue in his hands. He did not step inside. He only stood at the threshold, and when Noel came toward him, he offered her the flowers and said softly, "I don't know what to say." Noel took the bouquet, looked up into eyes that had lost some of their old coldness, and answered in a voice quiet as a whispered note, "Then don't say anything at all." They walked out of Symphony Center side by side, beneath the last late spring snowfall of the year, not holding hands, not speaking, simply moving together in a silence that no longer needed sound to be understood. 2 months passed after that night of white hydrangeas, and Chicago entered autumn with red maple trees burning along Michigan Avenue, with mornings cold enough for scarves but not yet cold enough for snow. Noelle Ashworth, now 28, had slowly regained her place in Chicago's musical life with calm dignity rather than fanfare. Right after the Symphony Center performance, the School of Music at Northwestern University sent her a formal invitation to serve as a visiting lecturer in composition. At first, she hesitated for 2 weeks, but in the end, she accepted because she knew Jasper would be proud to tell his classmates that his mother was teaching at a real university. She still kept her consulting contract with the Moretti Group, but now accepted only the largest projects, a few each quarter, spending the rest of her time on classes, on Jasper, and on the 3 new pieces slowly taking shape at the piano in the Wacker Drive apartment. Cornelius Whitaker was sentenced in federal court to 27 years in prison in mid-October after a trial lasting 5 weeks. His defense team tried every strategy they could invent, but each one was locked shut by the massive evidence Harrison's hard drive had provided. Jasper, now past 7 years old, entered 2nd grade at Lakeshore Country Day with his first true best friend, Emma, seated beside him in class. His asthma attacks had dropped to about twice a month instead of nearly every week. His cheeks had turned rosy again, and he had grown more than 2 full inches since the school year began. The relationship between Noel and Sterling over those 6 months had settled into a form that neither of them named. They were not lovers, had no formal title, and showed none of the public gestures that might feed society gossip. But they were no longer merely colleagues either. Sterling came for dinner at the Wacker Drive apartment once or twice a month, always bringing a bottle of wine or a box of cannoli from the Italian bakery his mother had loved when she was alive. Jasper no longer called him Mr. Moretti or that man, but had naturally shifted one night, without anyone noticing exactly when, into calling him Uncle Sterling, and Sterling had taught him how to play chess on an old walnut set that had once belonged to Giancarlo. Those Saturday afternoons when Uncle and Boy sat at the glass table overlooking the Chicago River had become a quiet ritual all 3 of them secretly looked forward to. On a Wednesday evening, in mid-September, after Jasper had brushed his teeth, read 10 pages of a children's book, and fallen asleep in his own room, Noelle sat down at the piano and began to play a short passage she had written earlier that afternoon. Her left hand by then, after nearly 5 months of physical therapy 3 times a week with Dr. Renata Kozlowski, had begun to manage single notes and a few slow broken chords. It was not whole again as it had once been, but it was no longer only a dead hand. The notes she played were not perfect. A few still fell off the beat, a few still lacked strength, but they existed, and that was something she would not have dared believe possible 3 years earlier. The doorbell rang just as she finished the phrase. Sterling stepped in wearing a gray wool coat and black leather gloves, set a box of cannoli on the kitchen table, then sat down on the sofa behind the piano without saying a word. He remained there for 5 full minutes, listening as she played the short passage 3 times over. Then he spoke in a quiet, deep voice. "Noelle, I need to tell you something tonight." Noelle lifted her hands from the keys and turned on the bench to face him. She did not answer. She only waited. Sterling looked directly into those amber eyes, the eyes he had denied himself the right to linger on for too long every time he saw her over the last 6 months. I don't know whether I'm the right man for you. My life is still complicated, still marked by things that a whole lifetime may not be enough to erase. But these last 6 months have been the first time in 13 years that I haven't felt like a symbol, haven't felt like a family name, haven't felt like the Iron Hand of Chicago the way people still call me. I have felt simply like a human being. And that, Noelle, is because of you. Noelle clasped her hands together in her lap and asked softly, "What are you saying, Sterling?" He rose from the sofa, but did not move closer, keeping just enough distance so that the words would not feel like pressure. "I'm saying that I love you, Noelle. I know I have no right to demand anything. I know Harrison can't be replaced, and I don't want to replace him. I only want you to know that, as a truth, nothing more." Noelle rose from the piano bench and walked slowly to the tall window overlooking the curve of the Chicago River, yellow city lights stretching all the way to the horizon. She looked down at her left hand, at Harrison's silver bracelet still resting there after 3 years, then turned and looked straight at Sterling. "For 3 years, I thought love had died inside me with Harrison, buried so deep that I no longer remembered its shape. But these last 6 months have shown me that love didn't die at all. It only changed into something else, quieter, deeper, and entirely different. I don't know whether I love you in the same way I loved Harrison, Sterling, but I do know one thing for certain. I can't imagine the coming year without you in it." Sterling stepped forward, took her right hand in his, did not kiss her, did not embrace her, only held it lightly. "Then can we go very slowly?" Noelle smiled, tears already shining at the corners of her eyes. "As slowly as possible, Sterling." 1 year after the night, Sterling took Noelle's hand beside the Wacker Drive window and promised to go as slowly as possible. Chicago autumn returned once more with red maples blazing along Michigan Avenue, and on a September morning, Noelle and Jasper were driven by Sterling to the old home of Beatrice Moretti in Lake Forest, north of the city. Sterling's grandmother was 72 that year, still carrying the upright bearing of a Sicilian woman who had never once learned to bow her head, her white hair pinned neatly up, her black eyes sharp as a fresh-poured espresso. She sat in a brown leather chair in the living room with its old red-patterned tile floor and looked Noelle up and down for a full half-minute without blinking, then spoke in Italian-accented English, still strong despite more than 50 years in America. "My girl, I can see very clearly in your eyes that you have suffered, but I also see something more important still. You have never fallen. My Sterling has needed exactly a woman like that in his life. Welcome to the Moretti family." She rose, embraced Noelle in a brief but tight hug, then turned to Jasper, who was peeking from behind his mother's legs, and offered him an orange candy from the old tin box resting on the tea table. 3 months after that meeting, on an early December afternoon when the ancient Sicilian olive tree conservatory of the estate had just entered its season of small green fruit, Noelle and Sterling were married exactly as they had both wanted, only 30 of their dearest guests. No reporters, no hired photographers, no symphony orchestra, no red roses. Beatrice sat in the front row beside Rowan Gallagher in the gray suit he had worn for more than 20 years. Yuki Tanabe and his wife Haruko sat to the right. A few of Noelle's old musician friends from Juilliard sat in a row behind them. Noelle wore a classic white gown falling to her ankles, with no lace and no beadwork, only an old silver hair clip once belonging to her mother, and on her left wrist still rested Harrison's silver bracelet, which she had never removed. Sterling wore a light gray 3-piece suit, the first time in 14 years that he had not chosen black for a formal occasion. Jasper served as ring-bearer, wearing a silk bow tie twice the size necessary for a 7-year-old boy, walking with solemn slowness along the clear stone path leading to the olive tree. When the two of them stood facing each other beneath the silvery leaves shimmering in the afternoon sun, Sterling took Noelle's hand and spoke his vows in a deep voice that now carried no trace at all of the iron hand he had once been known as. "Noelle, I lived 34 years in a world where people lied to survive, to make money, to protect themselves. You are the first person in my life who listened to me instead of only speaking at me. I promise you that I will listen to you every day, to every melody you write and every silence you need, for the rest of our lives." Noelle lifted her face, her amber eyes bright with tears, and answered in a voice quiet but steady. "Sterling, That April night you saw me through a security camera. A woman standing alone in front of a machine room door, unknown to everyone and wanted by no one. You did not look away. You asked one simple question. Who is that woman? That question saved my life, and it saved my son's life too. I promise that I will continue to be the person you saw that night. Someone who never stops listening. They kissed, lightly as a note fading into the air, and then Jasper stepped forward, holding a small piece of paper, his voice solemn. Mom, Uncle Sterling, I have a piece of music. I wrote it just for you. He walked to the upright piano that had been placed beneath the olive tree and began to play a short melody of about 40 seconds. It was simple, only 15 notes, but played with both small hands working together perfectly. Noelle began to cry. Sterling rested a hand on her shoulder and said nothing. That night, after all 30 guests had gone home and the yellow garden lights had dimmed low, Noelle, Sterling, and Jasper walked slowly along the stone path around the olive tree. The lights of Chicago blinked faintly on the southern horizon like a band of fallen stars. Sterling said softly, My mother once taught me an Italian phrase, La musica è la voce dell'anima. Music is the voice of the soul. Noelle leaned her shoulder against him and answered, The soul knows what to say, even when our mouths do not, my love. Jasper, running a little way ahead, suddenly turned back and lifted one finger to his lips. Mom, Uncle, listen. He stood perfectly still and closed his eyes. There was no sound at all but the soft wind passing through the silver olive leaves, yet he nodded with the seriousness of an old musician who had heard what others missed. That's the melody of happiness. I can hear it so clearly. And in the years that followed, Noelle kept the beige uniform from the copper kettle folded carefully at the bottom of one corner of her closet. She never explained to anyone, not even to Sterling, why she could not throw it away. But sometimes, late at night while sitting alone in her composing room, she would catch sight of that uniform through the narrow opening of the closet door and remember that April night, the night she stood still for 4 minutes before a machine room door in the Blackwood building, the night an unknown woman heard a sound no one else could hear. She had not returned as the person she used to be. She had returned better, not because Sterling had rescued her from the darkness, but because she had allowed herself to be rescued, to be heard, to be loved one more time in her life. And her ears, the purest gift heaven had left her after everything else had been taken away, had not only heard music, they had heard the truth. If this story has touched something deep inside your heart, we sincerely hope you'll take a second to like the video, share it with loved ones you believe may also need to hear a healing melody like this, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so that each day you can continue listening with us to more emotional stories. How did you feel about Noelle and Sterling's journey? Which moment made you cry? And which line stayed in your mind the longest? Please write it in the comments below so we can hear what truly moved you from the deepest part of your heart. We wish all of you watching this video very good health, a joyful and peaceful life each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.